Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Ooh. Can I have POIs in chat, please? Right, starting in 3, 2, 1. I think that shareholder activism arose out of a recognition that rich people make the rules their own way, both in society but also within the corporations that they own. It's perceived that because of this, that just the vote will never be enough for any reasonably minority shareholder to ever have a say within the corporation, and therefore the solution that they come to is shareholder activism. What are we willing to support? I think this looks like the rise that has seen people turn to the media, for instance, in terms of reporting the things that happen within this corporation and to like make their demands clear as per the info slide. I think this also looks like the lobbying of politicians in favor of what these particular shareholders would like. This looks like other legal avenues in order to stop to achieve the outcome that the shareholder activists want. What have these outcomes given us in the last couple of years? I think this looks like one, the increased environmental standards that have been pressurized from corporations. So for example, the fact that venture capital firms increasingly enforce like climate risk strategies to be reviewed within investment decision making in order to protect the environment. Labor laws that have been successful in enforcing the ways in which like we place responsibility on the top of the corporation for things for like labor rights abuses that might happen further down the supply chain. These are all unique things that we think have been created as a result of shareholder activism, and we'll give you structural reasons why we think that's likely to continue. What is the alternative world I think the OP needs to defend? It is a world in which I think that there's a continuation of a strict power and strict voting basis within these particular corporations. That is a world in which like there's a belief that capital gives you the right to power because that same capital gave you more votes within that system. The implication of this is twofold. The first is that there's a structural lack of information that comes out to the public because there's no belief in taking these negotiations outside the boardroom, and that means people are more likely to abide by these previous conceptions of confidentiality. But secondly, there's also less of an impetus to collaborate and listen because the biggest and richest continue to have the ability to monopolize, and there's no other way for anyone else to threaten their power. The third thing I want to note is that insofar as like going to the media and things like that are options, these are less of options at the point that this isn't a trend. And that means that on that side of the house, they have to defend a world in which these options don't exist. Two arguments therefore. First, why we think this is principally necessary on the part of minority shareholders. Second, why we think this leads to good outcomes. The first thing I want to note before this, however, the point of framing is just who I think is likely to adopt these strategies. The reality is that to my mind, these are unlikely to be people who have the power within these corporations, but rather lesser like people with less stake who are less able to control the board via voting. Why do I think it's principally necessary? Therefore, the first thing I want to recognize is why shareholders are given votes at the point of listing a corporation. And the reality is, I think this is because in return for their investment, we believe that they are given the right to determine the decisions that are going to affect the quality of the investment, the return that they're going to get on that particular investment. We think that insofar as that this is effectively the same principle by why we extend the vote in the status quo. The reality is that if we told you in the world writ large that you weren't able to use other means to increase the power of your vote, such as going to the media at a point that something went wrong in terms of the way you think politics is working, we would think that's ridiculous. And the basis of that is a belief that insofar as the vote exists, it is an insufficient mechanism and it doesn't replace the other rights that you have, such as your freedom of speech, in order to affect the decisions that are going to ultimately affect your life. We think that this specifically is therefore important, especially given the framing that I've given you about the imbalance within these systems. A system where, for example, Warren Buffett's corporation is structured in a way that he and his close friends are always going to have the decision-making power, independent of what happens in terms of the other decisions that are made. The reality is that the impact of this is democracy within these structures is fundamentally broken, which means that the only way for these smaller investors to ever have power is shareholder activism. Insofar as many of these shareholders are who have less money are also likely to be people like the middle class for whom these investments are seen as the way into their retirement, for whom these are seen as a way in which they can like secure economic futures. We think that these are people who are important to protect. CO.
Why is it necessary that minority shareholders are the only people and necessarily have good interests for society at large?
Yeah, going on to that, why do I think I get good outcomes? The first thing we think is that it gives rise voice to minority shareholders. To directly answer the POI, there are several reasons why we think this is likely to be the case. The first is that if you think about it, presumably if you require shareholder activism, you are in a position where you are making a decision that goes against the majority of what shareholders want. Given the framing that I've given you, that the rich people are likely to be majority shareholders, but also that most people who buy into these corporations probably buy into concepts of wanting profit and buy into capitalist conceptions, it is therefore likely that these individuals probably have a profit motivation, and that this more often than not is mutually exclusive from societal benefit. That's why structurally it's the case that if you needed to opt out of the strict voting structure, this probably was because the strict voting structure didn't appeal to you, i.e. these are people who are pro society. But the second thing to note is that to the degree that I think that is that beyond people naturally being inclined, it's also the case that often people are able to buy into corporations in order to change the way that they behave. We're talking about minority investors, for example, who tend to see the world in a different way because of the different lived experiences, or the fact that people might want to use these methods in order to correct the ways in which corporations are behaving as an alternate means of pushing for social change within the status quo. Only with the rise of shareholder activism are these seen as possible, and therefore these individuals are able to create change. But the second broad thing I'm going to note is that I think this changes the way in which decisions are made into being one that is more collaborative. And this is important for two reasons. The first, this happens because you go to the media, for example, and that therefore means that the public is more aware of things that are happening. There are two impacts here. The first is greater transparency. I've previously explained why I don't think this happens on that side of the house. The reason I think this is important is because I think corporations ultimately, one, affect individuals' daily lives and decisions that they make. I think this is intuitive. But second, also a lot of the decisions they make are incredibly shady, such as, for example, the amount of money that is used for political lobbying, things that are not likely to be otherwise released in terms of reports to the public, or that journalists are likely unable to access. This is the unique way, therefore, that we're able to move this information into the public sphere because shareholders are willing to contribute this information. But the second thing to note is that in terms of public pressure, this enables the public to have more of a say at a point that not only they know what's happening, but we normalize a world in which, because you turn to the media and create this public pressure, that corporations are more reactive to public pressure because shareholders believe and see this as a potential way out, instead of believing that just because they're minority shareholders, they have no other option. The implication of this is that at the point that the public has more of an ability to control and affect the way in which corporations make decisions, then we think that it's more likely that these decisions are in line with what the public wants and therefore protect the wider societal good. That's something I'm proud to propose. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that speech, and I'd like to welcome the leader of UP on the floor. Here.
Is it less laggy?
I think we can hear you.
Yeah, video is laggy, but audio is fine.
So is the audio fine? That's the most important thing.
Yeah, audio is fine.
Built-in mic. Yeah. Does anyone have any issues hearing me? Am I perfectly audible or not?
For now, you're audible. If there's any issues, I'll stop the timers and we'll intervene.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, a lot of direct responses to the Prime Minister. Secondly, why companies make better economic decisions and better help the company in the long term and in the short term. 3, why this reduces the effectiveness of companies and how they grow and the impacts of that. 1, who does the activism? Opening governments say that it is often it's often poor people, minority people within these industries, specifically because rich people who already have a lot of capital in this industry have no incentive to do so. The reason that this is not true is because the necessary resources to do things like have lawsuits or take out media ads are often incredibly expensive and are often require a lot of time and focus in order to get any form of change. This often requires a lot of capital, which means the individuals who do so are often wealthy ones. But 2, the types of individuals, even if they are wealthy, often do not always have a lot of capital, right? Like a lot of share capital, shares. And that specifically means that they often want to create the version of the company that they believe is right. So they're likely to leverage that vision therefore. The second premise that I want to engage with is, who do companies listen to? Because OGs say that you never get listened to, but I do not know why, because they say that it's only because you're not rich. They listen to their shareholders because they often want to make these individuals happy, because at the point where they're not not making their shareholders to some extent happy and benefiting them within the company, they're likely to factor that into that decision, whether they want to invest more into that company or go elsewhere. So they have an incentive to at least be nice to all of these shareholders. But secondly, there's a spreading effect. If they are dickheads or do not listen to any of these shareholders, this is likely to spread to other shareholders, right? It doesn't have to be public shaming. It's often just tell your friends that this company wasn't that effective. That's not shareholder activism. That's just telling your friends, and that is likely to mean that companies want to do so. But the third thing is often companies identify they're not experts in all areas, so often want to talk to individuals who are their shareholders from a lot of different backgrounds. So often means you get those voices listened to and they input into the decision and then output what they think the best thing to do so is. I don't think OG can prove that always the minority view is the best, otherwise all of the shareholders would want to do this. The third mechanism that I'd like to point out is that they are specifically say that, oh, you can get a media ad and this is likely to change their behavior. But look, I think the company will feel the need to defend itself from criticism in the media, which means it's likely to turn inwards and not engage with you as much, which means you get even less of the engagement they want on their side. The second thing is you're likely to be seen as making concessions at the point that you concede. That's likely to be a slippery slope to encourage more of this activism, which means that they're likely to not want to do so and they're likely to be resilient, which means overall they get worse. The third thing they say is you get greater transparency. One, employees have an incentive to report abuses within their job because of the fact that they often may be harmed themselves from it, or two, want to make that company better because they identify that it benefits their wage. But the second thing is companies themselves are just afraid of abuses being leaked by the employees or other people, so they are likely to internally reform those practices preemptively because they identify the potential for harm in the future. Opening government are out, and now I'm going to afford two pieces of constructive. Why companies make better decisions? Because I think the types of decisions that opening government are going to have to stand over are things like hikes in dividends, which means the return on investment for shareholders, or just things that make the company worse off because those investors believe that the decision they are making, even if it is irrational to do so, they believe it is what they are doing is best. Three reasons that companies are better and shareholders are worse. The first is their incentives. That is to say that these companies are likely to be incredibly long-termist because they care about the company and the growth, not in the next 2 or 3 years, but in the next 20 years. So they're likely to want to keep profits in order to reinvest it into that company and help it to grow into the future. But also note, this is why they care about the environment, because they identify in the future they need to be more environmentally friendly and help those explore that market, but also improve their standing. The comparative is shareholders want to maximize the profits in the short term, so they're likely to encourage all of these shitty practices that OG want to talk about, especially when they have the capacity to leverage externally. Because note, all the individuals who make the decision are not just the shareholders, it's often the experts that they often have to defer to. The second thing is trade secrets. That is to say that they often understand the product and are able to do so. OG say that transparency is always good. I don't think that is true. I think this means they're able to understand the product and inform your decision. The comparative is there's often a lack of knowledge because you can't tell all of your investors how the company works, because then they could invest in you and then go sell it to Coca-Cola. The third thing is that experts. That is to say that these individuals are often specialized in market research, so have a degree of specialization in making decisions based on that market, so they're likely to make good decisions about what is in the interest of the company. The comparative is that investors often invest in multiple portfolios to diversify their risk, which means that they often have their interests spread out. The harms of this are the following. One, they just make worse economic decisions that looks like less investment within that business, which reduces its capacity to grow and help the economy overall by employing more people that they otherwise could have used on spending that money, but now they have to spend it on shareholder increases, etc., or just more expensive practices. The second thing is they get less investment, because investors, when they see that the things like this are likely to be overall worse due to shareholder activism, are likely to shift to more safe investment. This looks like government bonds. Government bonds are backed by the government and are paid at a fixed percentage. They are incredibly safe because the government is unlikely to default, and that means that you have a safe investment that you otherwise wouldn't. Before I go on, CG.
Yeah, so who runs these companies and what forces them to be long-termists when they have the right to liquidate their own stakes at any point?
I mean, they can liquidate it, but that's predicated on them either getting a return on investment from other people, or B, they don't want to undersell their stock. So if they want to sell it, they can. That's fine. That just means we get new investors who are better. Second point of substantive. Reduced effectiveness. The problem with OG is money is often set aside for the reduced profitability of companies is likely to occur. Why? One, they need to set aside a lot of money for lawsuits. That is to say that if rich shareholders, even per shareholders, are often using money to prolong lawsuits against that company, they are likely unable to get leverage. And that specific, in order to get leverage, which specifically means those lawsuits are likely to be incredibly long, incredibly expensive. And even if they have some degree of lawyers on the books at the moment, they're likely to have to hire more preemptively to do so. Given they have to defend a significantly increase in this, that is likely to mean that they are afraid of that in the future. The second thing thing is things like injunctions. So it's used at the most effective time to cause the most amount of damage, because you know that is when you are most likely to be listened to. What that means is they're likely to do so when you're likely to release like a new product, because that means you're likely to get delays in because you think that they'll listen to you more. That means you're likely to get delays in expansion, specifically because of the fact that in expansion, because of the fact that this is when you otherwise would have done so. This is often has tremendous economic harms, because it means these slows down the effectiveness of that company. The third thing is that you often have to dump more money into media relations, i.e. even if you're like a production company that otherwise didn't have to care about the media production, the media like pure side of your company, you know, specifically have to do so and dump more money into that. This is specifically likely to take money away from jobs that are on the base level that often are beneficial to the person society, of the least ability to offset potential harms to them because they have the less amount of money, compared to the rich people or even middle class people who can afford to invest on OG side, and they're incredibly more important actor. But secondly, they have a reduced capacity to expand and create spin-off effects from using that money to create more jobs. But thirdly, likely get reduced research and development that people often use on their daily lives, which means overall you're likely to get a worse quality of life. The fourth thing is just the reason that they often take this money is these are the individuals with the least amount of political capital within these companies. Gabby will explain that further. Cool.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister on the floor. Here.
Hi, can I check that you guys can hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right, cool, thanks. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I just think that OO refuses to debate any semblance of reality. I'm going to give you a few structural reasons why I think shareholders do care about the long-term future of their company. And I think to the extent to which I can prove to you, not even overwhelmingly that this is always true, but that there is a good, plausible reason why this policy is not going to be taken advantage of by these shareholders, we already take out the majority of OO's case. Number one, shareholders have a huge incentive to ensure that they are also similarly long-termist in the way that they look at the company and the kind of investment decisions that are made. Of course, shareholders care about whether or not they get paid out dividends, but dividends can only be paid out to shareholders at the point at which your company turns a profit. So presumably they do care about the company being able to actually earn money and actually invest it so that those profits increase in the long run. That also improves their dividends. If the company is not profitable, they don't get any money whatsoever. 2, if the company does better in the long run, or if it's seen to be making massive capital investments, even if the outcome of those investments have not yet been shown, oftentimes this leads to an increase in the share prices, which therefore means that the value of the stocks that they hold also go up, which therefore means that their portfolio is now worth more. So presumably they also have no incentive to go against advice from experts, etc., in order for them to be able, experts and the like, in order to get because it just makes more sense for them financially, right? Like they know that they don't know certain things. It's really unclear what the incentive is for them to go against the advice for the people who are meant to be running their company. 2, they say, oh, but now they're going to use lawsuits against them. Note that even if you don't buy the first 2 reasons, which is just, I don't know why you wouldn't. What's important to note is that the way that shareholder activism works is that it has to play out in some form in the court of public opinion, because one big way in which this happens is that they literally release things that the board is debating on, or certain incentives or policies or proposals they want to put up to the board, and they put it out there for the public to see at a point at which the board chooses not to recognize it, or other shareholders choose not to support it in an attempt to pressure other people to vote alongside them. This therefore suggests that the kind of things that they want to do that is likely to gain the most amount of traction are things that the public cares about. You think the public cares about whether or not you want to get more dividends for yourself? Presumably no, right? If you are arguing so strongly that there's going to be massive societal benefit if they put in more investments, then presumably the public will turn against you and argue that yes, you should invest more. Again, I think the argument is self-defeating. Third thing that they say is, but then they'll use lawsuits in an attempt to sort of get the management board fired. And here's where I want to deal with the first premise that I think is just wrong from their case. They argue that it's not going to be minority shareholders using this activist logic, but rather people who already have a lot of money. I just want to point out that if you're trying to control a large company, the amount of money required for you to be able to do a lawsuit or to take out an ad is significantly less than buying a controlling stake in the company. On the one hand, you're talking about maybe tens of thousands of dollars. On the other, you're literally looking at millions or potentially even billions of dollars if it's a larger company. That makes 0 sense, right? So presumably you have some money because you could buy shares in this company in the first place. But the scale at which they're talking about just makes no sense as to why you are not a minority shareholder. And I think that takes away a lot of the premises that exist in the OO's case about why the incentives or things they're fighting for will be bad. Next thing then that I want to talk about, why exactly do we think shareholder activism was incredibly important? The first thing that we suggested was that this was just an extension of the kind of powers that shareholders ought to have. The problem is the vast majority of companies and the way that they are structured are in such a way that shareholders that come in later and put their money down in order to try and get the company to grow because they believe in that vision and have put in like some measure of capital investment are not getting their voices heard because the company like structurally does not want to allow for new shareholders the capacity to take like power away from those that were there first. So if you look at Berkshire Hathaway, for example, there are literally like super shares that Warren Buffett gives to him and like his closest like 10 friends or something. That means that they can override any decision made by other shareholders. And this is true for the vast majority of companies that refuse to sell out additional holdings as well because they want to keep it within the family or keep it within the specific interest that they have. The reason why we think this is incredibly important is because oftentimes the people who are the ones at the top are the ones who got there first, the ones with the worst incentives and who are the most profit driven and therefore are the ones who created the structure of a company in a way that is like likely to exploit others. Note that given they don't prove that these are not minority shareholders, we need to first frame what minority shareholders care about. Presumably, a lot of the times, the reason why the board as a whole does not currently agree with you is because it does not benefit their interests. More dividends do. That's why, again, OO's case is incoherent. But things that they oftentimes do not really care about or may not be on your side about are things like, for example, corporate social responsibility, increasing the cost of producing a particular good by being less exploitative and less abusive and paying your employees a higher wage, not dumping oil into the river. These are the kind of things that are often the hallmark of shareholder activism. And the reason why this is true is also because these are more likely to play out in the public eye in a way that actually manages to corral positive support for this particular activist and enables them to sway the board in their favor because now they have created a negative media incentive that makes the company more likely to do what they want to do. We think that's the reason why activism is particularly important, and it's oftentimes only these shareholders that are able to create these kinds of outcomes because one, often things like sneaky government funding, for example, are largely hidden from the public eye, but also two, often things like environmental degradation and the like are quite difficult to trace to particular companies, and so you require an additional avenue of information to know what exactly its corporate practices are and what exactly is on the table of proposals to change them. Yes, or what do you want?
We only have to start. You've just done over a massive increase in this type of activism, the types of things that mean that you have to implement types of policy around environmentalism that are incredibly expensive. That is the impact of our case, that these are bad for these businesses.
Yeah. So like, yes, I agree, it's very expensive. It's also things that you probably shouldn't have been doing in the first place. So presumably you should take on those costs unless you want to run to me the idea that it is more important for rich people to earn more money than to protect our environment and ensure that people in Bangladesh are not starved of a living wage. Then presumably you're not winning this particular argument. We are literally saying that companies who are currently making super normal profits in most instances can afford to do this. The more shareholder activism that happens, the more all of these corporations do the same thing, which therefore means that the market standard as a whole increases. You're also talking about things like, for example, giving more wages to your people so they can afford the higher cost of these kinds of goods. I don't necessarily think that arguing that this money is going to go to capital investment is going to change anything if that capital investment is going to result in like the continuation or increase in worse practices, like for example, environmental degradation, the like some other extraneous stuff. They said there's not going to be abuse within that company because these companies have an interest of people not abusing them and employees have an interest to report. Are you kidding me? Like you could potentially get fired. Obviously, you're not going to whistleblow against your company. The power asymmetry that exists there does not like match up to reality. But also corporations do this all the time because they know they have that leverage. Again, shareholder activism is oftentimes the only way which they're able to do these kind of things. But secondly, also, oftentimes it's also has to do with things like divestment from potentially profitable things that are politically sensitive as well, which we think is good, where we are able to turn corporate power against the companies by putting it up for democratic transparency. We're incredibly happy to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and I'd like to welcome the DLO on the floor. Here.
Can I be heard?
Yep.
Class. Okay, I'm just getting my timer out. Okay. Sorry, okay. The first thing I want to note is that they have to stand over a significant increase. So if there are minor situations where it's used for a force for social good on a really high target, high profile case every once in a while, we can have that on our side. But the fact that it is a norm, it is used, it is expected, it is a thing companies see happening frequently in many situations is something we think is bad for everyone involved. But most importantly, it is bad for the people who are going to demand that you're going to cut the costs. They're going to be the small time workers, and we get more into that. But first on a bit of rebuilding and dealing with when it will be used, when it will succeed, note, because all of their cases are contingent on them convincing all of the other shareholders that you actually shouldn't like do whatever it is environmentally or abuse your workers or whatever, and everyone else being like, yeah, that was a pretty compelling case. Even the people who are the board, who have more sway over you, who they think are evil, but are going to some reason relent. Why are they not likely relent in those situations and others? So firstly, most situations, like the interests of the company and the small investors and everyone are going to align. The board was elected by the shareholders. They want to please them. They want to make money in the short and long run, whatever. When is it going to diverge? Firstly, it could be financial reasons. I'm going to deal with that in a second, but it also can be non-financial with social and ideological. But here's the thing. The reason you have a right to input is because it affects you. It's proportional. You have lots of interest in it going forward, which is why the people with large amounts of shares probably care more about it. People who are living there on depending on their day-to-day wage, particularly, it's hard to liquidate or just go out of it. If you're the CEO of a fucking company, they're going to wonder, why did you liquidate your exits for? But more importantly, it's hard to sell out if you have a lot of shares, because then you flood the market by trying to sell them off. That is to say that when they are in high supply and low demand, because you've just sold off all of your shares, so it's harder to physically exit. But if you are the type of shareholder they're talking about that is a small amount, that means that you can do things like take a small amount, look for ways to temporarily inflate it by doing things like cutting costs or lobbying and saying, well, actually, everyone, we should galvanize you by saying, well, actually, I don't believe those people deserve breaks or whatever, by cutting costs, by reducing the amount of people working on your shop floors. They do not care about the long-term human capital turnover, because they are looking to buy when it is low and sell when it is high, and therefore they don't care, as long as they can galvanize other shareholders and get these are situations where they're more likely to buy into them by doing things like cutting costs. Those are the people that are incredibly vulnerable in this situation, who are much higher than like people who are relatively entirely rich or kind of entirely rich or whatever should care about a lot. So that's why it's very likely to be manipulated in times of financial situations, why those manipulations are likely to impact people who are in the more vulnerable relatively situation and have the incentives of them differ to literally everyone else in their companies. Because I also think, regardless, it is unlikely and it's very hard to see why exactly being like, but guys, even if they want to be like, don't kill the polar bears, it's unlikely why the board will immediately relent upon saying that. Because note, they say things like, but they'll put it in the public and there'll be public pressure, and to deal with this accountability mechanism that they give you. Like, it's not, firstly, you don't want them, and for the same reasons they give you, you don't want people to boycott your own company because your own money is tied up in it, so it's never going to get that public. But beyond that, even the minority shareholders, anyone doesn't want to do that. It's kind of very incoherent, is why you would say, like, this is a terrible company that I have personally invested in, everyone perceiving as good and a worthy investment because I have literally direct money inside of it. It's unlikely that they're going to attack them on those bases. But also, it's unlikely that even if they did, that it would actually materialize in the type of public accountability mechanisms they're talking about, most notably because the general public normally isn't that much persuasive on things like large-scale multinational corporations that are usually buying in business-to-business financial services and other relevant things that the actual direct public tends not to buy into and revolves in other situations. So what we're essentially saying here is that it's unlikely it will occur in their type of way, but it'll probably be more likely to be used against them. I want to deal with the social ideas. Firstly, I think it is inherent harm to people deserve to go to work and then leave work. That is to say that it's probably not fair to stress the board members out by having very personal public gripes and attacks on the things that they are doing, things that their family are maybe seeing, saying that like they're getting weird ads and LinkedIn messages. It's a harm in of itself to say that it's upsetting on people that they didn't sign up for this, and it's probably not fair, and it's probably a harm in of itself. But also, here's the thing. Why is the board more likely to make these environmentally friendly decisions? One, it's probably part of an advertising campaign, usually that's to do with like appealing to a certain type of voter base or people going into it. That's why we had that social responsibility advertisement motion earlier in the day that is hard to explain to board holders because it's probably been formulated over a huge amount of market research that's hard to articulate, but also they cannot leak because then other people would be like, this is just a thing for their own benefit, and therefore it would be counterintuitive. But also they're normally younger than their investors, so they've normally, to become an investor, you've had to accumulate an amount of capital to then be investing that a certain amount to actually live off a dividend or return from it. But if you're someone who's in that stage of working and accumulating capital, you're probably just younger, that probably means you are relatively younger social circles, more exposed to things like climate change, think that it's not a hoax, etc. But also you want to work there normally in the long term and like continue to work yourself up. That is to say, if you're employed next year, that is a massive income you get by the board deciding that you were doing well, by the company continuing to grow. You want them to be successful in 15 years, in 10 years, etc. But that is to say, you don't get the same short-term profits, etc., selling out on your shares at high values because you have large amounts of the company, but you're the fucking CEO already invested and tied up in it. But also, like, there's no inherent reason there to be more or less evil. And if they were really evil, they probably wouldn't listen to the things. So you then don't accrue their benefits and definitely accrue our harms. But that is to say, if you do make decisions like investing socially responsible because you're part of a large-scale advertising campaign, because you have internal biases, etc., note that the type of shareholders we're talking about that want to temporarily cut costs for whatever reason so that they can then get out and pay money, we probably think that it's in particular quite harmful. But we think more importantly, right, it means that you are probably going, there hasn't been a POI offered in chat, so I'm going to continue. It probably means that you are more proximate to these things, make these decisions better. But also, here's the thing, when it comes to like doing things like firing nasty men who make your human rights, who make your like human resources department actually very difficult to deal with, these are people that like your shareholders who probably appointed them, see themselves as a similar basis to them, are probably going to be galvanized on behalf. How could you ruin an innocent man's life, etc., because they aren't the people seeing him and working and deciding that it's actually negative on the whole. Because in both situations, companies make incentives and make decisions on the basis of what is good for companies. But like comparatively, people who are working there long term, depend on it year to year, don't want insecurity in the short term, don't want to deal with sexists, look toward and have more knowledge of environmental investments, rather than people who have small amounts of money relative to what other people invested, can sell out if it goes south, but also probably are only likely to be successful in that type of in their type of campaigns or whatever, in situations where they can convince people to do things like short-term cost cuts or whatever, temporary influence things, because that's where the board will agree, will always be making decisions in the incentives of profit. There is no magical world in which they say, huh, you're totally right. The worlds in which they do it are worlds in which they make poor decisions that hurt the vulnerable and poor people in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech, and I'd like to welcome